Hello everyone, rare to see you like this today. Today I'm going to be talking about Pokemon Legends EA. Now I know what you're thinking, what can I say that hasn't already been said? Well, to make a long story short, I've been absolutely addicted to the game for over 120 hours since launch. The post-game cycle after the newest season has been absolutely amazing. I'm having a lot of fun using off-meta picks to wreak havoc on the online modes. I did somewhat of an Oak run, like I normally do, that was pretty fun, and it offered me a lot of options when picking up the Mega Raid bosses. But I come to you today for a different reason, ones that have been repeated pretty often. Why is this game not like Arceus? Why is it not set in the past? Why can't I go inside buildings? And more importantly, why are the windows 2D textures? For this reason, we need to observe the way gameplay is made, and how every option is meant to facilitate a certain style of gameplay on the side of the player. I have quite a few games to use as examples, most of them unpopular for one reason or another, but all of them pretty much make sense, to an extent, when we put them under the microscope to see the little parts that make the big picture. Now, I'm not talking from any point of real authority, and as many would understand, neither are the complainers or glazers. What I can say is that I played over 100 games in the last 7 years, and understand how games are designed to an extent, which is why I don't usually give letter grades or say a game sucks when I review them. I may say that I didn't like it, or certain game feel elements didn't jive with me personally, and that's okay, but I even give some of the more notorious games a fair shake to an extent. Some may say I even enjoy them more than the best, most expensive AAA games on the market, and that is because they would speak to me and my particularities more than any of those other games would on a good day. So I guess we'll go over some examples of games and design elements I enjoy before hitting you with the Pokemon stuff, and why the gameplay loop has me more hooked than previous titles. We're going to go back and start with my old pal, Keiji Inafune. Now I know, most of you didn't like the Mighty No. 9 game he directed, but there's a precedent to his style of game design. I'm going to go over it meticulously, and eventually tie it back into Pokemon. And Mega Man X, a series many would claim his main brainchild of the Mega Man sub-franchises. There's an obscure mechanic in Uncharged Buster Challenges. It is the dash shot, and that is a shot that increases the X Buster's level 1 shot as a level 2 shot, and exists in both Mega Man X and Mega Man X2. This creates a risk-reward system for trying to get the personal best and speedrun times for those games. This game mechanic was utilized in the Zell dash attack. By shooting the enemy as fast as possible while approaching, Beck can pretty much beat any enemy without having to slow down. Shoot and dash into enough enemies in succession, and this creates a combo system. However, the one real setback one would care about is that the enemy gauntlets can slow down this intended rapid combo focused pace of the game. This brings us to another of Inafune's directed games, Azure Striker Gunvolt, particularly the first game and how it is different from the third game. So let's go over this for a bit. Azure Striker Gunvolt is a game where the main attacking mechanic, the Flash Field, tends to slow Gunvolt's recovery from the air, but can be utilized to jump large gaps or protect Gunvolt from incoming damage, depending on how it is utilized. The game awards extra combo points, called kudos, depending on how many enemies are tagged, and whether Gunvolt is airborne or not. The gauge for Flash Shield is then depleted over time, and once fully depleted, puts you into overheat. Immediately grounding yourself to charge puts you in a constant position to attack and defend frequently. The game has a lot of airtime, and that can leave Gunvolt vulnerable to attack depending on the situation. The game is essentially an evolution of Mighty No. 9's combo system. Gunvolt also has a gun that shoots needle-like strands of his hair used to conduct his flash field onto the opponent, but isn't mainly used for attacking. Now the third game varies wildly from the first, almost to the point it seems like a different series altogether. Kieran, the main character, has a tag system called Radiant Feathers. Similar to Gunvolt's gun, you send out feathers to attach to your enemies. You can either attack slowly or deliberately with a sword to deal extra damage, or by utilizing the arc chain, which is the main method of attack. Kieran basically warps to attack for a set amount of damage based on how many feathers are attached to the opponent. Cotton is a slow and deliberate ballet of Flash Field, now focused on a quick, close quarters salsa of upfront attacks and arc chain dodges, all in order to maintain a good kudos combo. These 4 different games utilize the same mechanics, with each one building off the other. The games aren't replacements for the old games they are based on, Rather, each one stands alone and offers a different and unique style of gameplay. I've enjoyed all 4 of these games for different reasons. Rather than simply being iterations of the same thing, they are all side-scrollers that play vastly different from each other. Kind of like another series I enjoy, but won't get into just yet. We're moving on to Disgaea 1 and 6. Bear in mind for a moment, I'll bare bones it for you. So the first thing you need to know is Disgaea is a tactical RPG. You play in a hilarious comedy of angels and demons vying for some cause, and this is the genius of the series. The game rewards you with comedy to take the pressure off the difficulty of the game, and rewards you with difficult maps and challenges as you proceed through the funny and tragic story. These 2 elements play off each other, but one thing that this guy couldn't get completely right was getting everybody to try the post-game. The post-game was easy enough for a tactician to decipher the correct way of getting through it, but it tended to remain impossible for the casual. Disgaea 6 is a divisive game. Instead of leveling up from 1 to 2, you start in what is essentially a semi-post game for a main character. He has reincarnated many times, and thus his beginner levels reach absurd amounts. This turns off a lot of newcomers and old heads, but to me, I enjoy it as a piece of what a normal Disgaea postgame has to offer, but in starter set form. This is further accentuated by the fact that all the characters in this particular game, Disgaea 6, wear red. A color reserved only for the main character throughout the series of the Disgaea games. Edna mode counts, but the Axel mode does not. So basically the main game is essentially a power fantasy parody of the entire series, and where the main character does not need to do much in order to get to the end. It is streamlined to ask the player to experiment with its many systems and create incredibly broken characters that will dominate the post-game and DLC offerings. It asks you to go back and check what other other Disgaea games have to offer. A game need only be as poor as the imagination of one who plays it. So finally, for now at least, because I could go on about this, we get to Sonic. Sonic is a series that varies wildly in art and gameplay from game to game. Rather than stay still in one spot for too long and reiterate much to so-called true blue fans' chagrin, this series is always on the move. Whether it be a platformer, a meticulously crafted world made to speed bump you in an attempt to thwart your pursuit of a better future, a 3D fighting game, a fighting 3D game, a technical speed run crash course, or a series of boss gauntlets, each game has its own unique personality and flair. There's literally a Sonic for everyone. This brings us back to the Switch era of Pokemon. I see a lot of people claim that the games have had a rocky start, that the games can't seem to find a cohesive style of design in true TT, but that is not what I see. I see a lot of talking points that mimic the ones in Mega Man and Sonic fandoms, mostly going around, to a much louder degree, just because Pokemon is the most popular series in the world compared to those aforementioned series. I have maybe over a little of 1,550 hours of playtime over the course of 7 years of the Switch's life between the 6 titles of the game. Obviously, I'm an anomaly of some sort, somewhere in between the Venn diagram of competitive battler and challenge runner, so I enjoy these games somewhat more outside the scope of how they are normally played by a casual audience. I have some deep insight that some semblance of an Oak run is possibly the intended run of a Pokemon game. I think Game Freak are actually pretty smart to not make all their games feel and look the same, and understand that just like Sonic, there's a method to their madness, and we're going to go over it. We're going to go over a few things throughout this video, and this is game scope, which is a narrow goal of a game's development in order to achieve cohesion, game style, which is the overall artistic presentation of a game, as opposed to just plain old graphical fidelity, and how they help facilitate certain gameplay elements on the side of the player, and game feel, which is the intangible je ne sais quoi or aura surrounding a game that helps it feel like a game. Much more pointed than that nebulous soul people like to toss around. These are my markers on if a game feels good or not. Not many point systems or hardline critique without any experience. I am an artist after all, and being an artist means that I have a certain insight and certain experience with critique, both good and bad, that I must take into account. With that out of the way, we're going to go back in time to black and white. Many of you who are more vocal probably weren't around during the heyday of Pokemon, but Black and White 1 and 2 version were the most unpopular games in the franchise. They may have been story-heavy games, heavily focused on some lore, but the drop-off of that era is something to be studied. The games were sprite-based, yes, but they didn't exactly appeal to the target demographic at the time. The resurgence of popularity of those particular games now reminds me akin to the popularity Mega Man saw during the early aughts. Emulation of these games had been cracked. The games found a new, fresh, young audience with a lot of time on their hands but little cash or time to attain them with. At the time of the height of Mega Man's popularity, new, cheaper titles were introduced to capitalize. A set of games just only $30 each with a replayable gameplay loop, the Battle Network series and the Zero series. There was a group of overly loud and obnoxious types that vehemently wrote off the newer series as not feeling like a true franchise game. That $30 was still pretty steep for a kid at the time though, due to where wages sat, but affordable nonetheless. Why am I singling out Black and White 1 and 2? I feel like these games are when Bloat started to hit the series, and why it was cut back in the Switch era of the games. The games had so many, maybe too many legal Pokemon and items, 649 Pokemon and 130 viable battle-held items, not including berries. The whole competitive was set behind the post-game gauntlet Battle Subway, a mess of a gauntlet that's original intention was to get the player used to practicing competitive Pokemon. For every 7 battles, you were rewarded 3 battle points, a currency specifically only reserved for those who couldn't survive a streak. For every 21, you were rewarded 10 battle points and an unlock into Super, which goes on endlessly, is much harder, and rewards more points for a longer streak. I call it a mess because it sits somewhere in between a slot machine and a battle facility. In fact, rose-tinted glasses aside, all of the Battle Frontier facilities are glorified slot machines. You bring in 3 or 4 Pokemon depending on whether it's single or double, you try your hand at winning, and if you survive the gauntlet with your choice of Pokemon, you're rewarded with even more battles and more attempts at building up the currency for the item you need. A person going in with a set training regimen for their monsters, a strategy to win, and sticking to it was the key to coming out relatively unscathed. Anything less is just being foolhardy. This type of system unnaturally bloated the competitive player's time spent playing the core game to astronomical levels that could and did lead to eventual burnout among more casual players, gatekeeping the best items a casual player may need to experiment with in order to become competitive to only those with the most patient of patient players of the game. Well, that was the intention anyways. Let's fast forward to Sun and Moon, because if I talk about the Battle Mason in X and Y, and the Battle Tower in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, I'll just be repeating the same points and going into why the Battle Frontier doesn't exist anymore, which I can explain just by continuing. Bloat reached its max in this game. It is extremely dense with wild Pokemon, and the obtainables reach a maximum of 802 Pokemon, and about 100 competitively viable held items, 29 Z crystals, a couple more if you count Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, and about 50 Mega Evolutions, 2 of which are primal reversions, bringing the total to a whopping 180 competitively viable held items for the game, not including berries. In order to get through the competitive side of things, the player must go through a post-game gauntlet called the Battle Tree, a version of Battle Tower or Battle Subway that incentivizes the player by bringing back old characters to the series on the path to gaining battle points. Sounds just a little bit familiar, right? Using things like comedy or nostalgia to massage the player is a good strategy on the side of the developer. It can make what seems like a slog of a game more enjoyable for a person who is open to it. Sword and Shield version, scope creep was mitigated by controlling both the amount of Pokemon and held items the player had access to about 400 Pokemon, 600 with the DLC, just shy of 110 possible viable competitive held items, not including berries. This opened up the possibility of a puzzle-like raid system that drastically cut down on the number of available Pokemon in order for trainers to offer creative solutions for tackling down Dynamax and Gigantamax Pokemon in max raids, and eventually in Terra raids and Scarlet and Violet versions. While Scarlet and Violet bumped up the number of total items by including drop loot from Pokemon that could be turned into items via the TM machine, trading with NPCs or the item printer, those items weren't competitively important to the scope of the game's whole item system. The list of competitively viable items was reduced to about less than 100, not including berries. For those keeping count, the only reason why I'm not including berries is because I had forgotten to count each competitively viable berry for each generation of the game, and I don't feel like going back and looking it up. The amount of competitively viable berries is much shorter than the amount of usable ones, if that makes sense. Scarlet and Violet also mitigated its scope creep by limiting the total amount of Pokemon, DLC included, to about 400 Pokemon, around 650 if you include the DLC. Notice how I haven't touched upon the RPG aspect of Pokemon yet? That's because Pokemon is an RPG second, and a monster raising and battle simulator first. The RPG part of the game facilitates the player in the competitive or cooperative play, and on a good day helps the competitive or cooperative player find a bit of respite in the story. We'll get into how that flows into Legends EA later, but first we gotta talk about Legends Arceus. Legends Arceus is what I would like to call an ambitious game. It is the first sub-franchise game in the main line series of Pokemon games. If that sounds confusing to you, it's kinda how like all the Mega Man Classic X, Zero, ZX, and Legends games are considered mainline games, but are sub-franchises within the same franchise of games, featuring different gameplay mechanics outside the norm, while not straying too far from what made the game feel popular to begin with. With ZA, it has been established that the sub-franchise of games is meant to flesh out the lore and world of main series titles, while exploring different gameplay mechanics. As such, these games feature the most narrow of project scopes. They are highly experimental for the studio developing them, and therefore are more like fully fleshed out minigames with an emphasis on story. The game is set about 200 years in the past, during what should be around the Meiji Restoration in the homeland of the Ainu, or the Diamond and Pearl clans, and what we now know today as Hokkaido. In order to facilitate the story of the game, a certain type of gameplay had to be introduced. That was a survival and crafting style of gameplay. The player is limited in resources and must gather materials in order to craft things in order to continue to play the game. The exploration, gather, craft, catch gameplay loop was established. In order to craft rarer materials or to catch stronger Pokemon, one would need to take a chance at exploring more dangerous areas of the map in order to meet that goal, with the final bosses being a test of the player's reaction time, but not resources. The survival aspect was mainly focused on the map of the area, with the bulk of the challenge surviving up until the boss battles with your resources. Focus on the game is strictly on completing the Pokédex itself, with little emphasis on competitive battling. Here in this statement, I have established both the game scope and the game feel, but not the game style. The reason being is that a lot of detractors like to downplay the game style for looking like quote-unquote mud, when in reality a game looks the way it does to facilitate a certain feel about the game. In this case, we can look at the skybox of Arceus and see that the game's look was inspired by woodblock paintings and manga art specifically, with a sort of strong gouache or manga marker color effect on the people, Pokemon, and environments. This is opposed to, say, another traditional style like ukiyo-e and watercolor, style which was used heavily in games like Okami and the DLC trailer for the untold story of Petra, to facilitate a different kind of feel for those types of media. The whole package presents itself to feel more historical than a gussied up, high quality texture pack would have allowed the game to feel like, and anything more would detract from the overall scope of the game. In this way, the game scope, the game feel, and the game style are heavily tied to one another. A game in the opposite direction that the Pokemon Company put out that does not tie these things together very well is Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. As much as I love these games, they do not, at least at first glance, feel very Japanese Hokkaido inspired compared to previous titles unless you look for it or have been there yourself. While I don't mind the chibi classic art style that harkens back to the original games, it's not really necessary for the game to feel one way or the other. It does, however, facilitate quick gameplay sessions and information, which I believe was in the intention, as the underground was a big component of these games and sometimes required wireless communication and portability to get the full experience. Same could probably be said of Gen 8 as well. Sword and Shield did not look as cohesive as Legends Arceus had tried to go for, though they do feature nice sunsets in the evening that are reminiscent of British paintings. The focus in game scope outside of the monster raising was on, for an initial playthrough, soccer hooligan shenanigans, and to a post-game degree, historic revisionism, both good and bad. Gen 9 featured better Pokemon model textures at the cost of system instability, performance, and background textures. And while the games were fun and featured a good story, with the game scope primarily focused on telling a bunch of slice-of-life stories, culminating in an overall theme of ecosystem conservation from an outside threat. By the way, this trope has been in almost every Poké-clone, by the way. And Pokemon and Digimon both did it respectively, in Pokemon Sun and Moon and Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth. So this is their second time using this, but to a greater effect and emotional weight. While the environment and new monsters were very Spain inspired, and you can even eat bocadillos for timed effects, There was a little cohesion between the game feel, the game style, and the game scope. It didn't necessarily do anything previous games in the Pokemon series couldn't do, other than have a big open area to explore with a lot of things to do and see. That in of itself is a feat. But if we're going to boil down the game's scope, it's catch monsters, see the 3 storylines, 5 if you have the DLC, maybe battle people along the way if you felt like it, I don't know. You don't have to if you don't want to. Don't get me wrong, I love Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. The presentation was all over the place, ranging from wow, this is kind of mid to holy shit, Area Zero, and Kitakami, and the Blueberry Academy. He really pulled off all the stops there, and the music, oh my god. But I digress. So that brings us to Legends EA. Finally, after about 30 minutes of context, I can finally cover the thing I started this video for in the first place. Yay me, I got exhausted writing the script, but we're there, we're golden. And shoutouts to those of you who read or own the Clefairy Tale issue of the Electric Tale of Pikachu. This is a reference to all 5 of you. Anyways, where was I? Oh yes, so in order to understand Pokemon Legends EA, one must first understand game scopes and gameplay loops. I hope you've been following along, but game scope is necessary for creating a cohesive game. One with too much scope bloat tends to come off as a mess. One with too little can feel like too expensive for what it's trying to do. If you don't engage your player to see the full breadth of content you have to offer, but price your game accordingly, then the player will feel like they didn't come out with enough value from the game. Artificially inflating the player's engagement and time spent with a game can come with fatigue and eventually lead to burnout. This is a problem with most Pokemon games, as the time spent on them will greatly underwhelm an adult player with little time on their hands, greedily munching on game after game. If the loop is engaging, then the player will continue even unabated, though some kind of reward is necessary to continue engagement. So we know Pokemon Legends EA's gameplay loop by now. I'm going to sound like one of the world's biggest nerds putting this into technical speak, but here it goes. The game has a time-based loop based on a 48-minute clock, with 32 minutes during the day segment of the game and 60 minutes at night. Non-player characters will populate different areas depending on the time of the day, but this has little effect on the ability to take or complete missions. Anyways, the gameplay loop is simple. There's an emphasis on catching Pokemon during the day and completing story-based missions, while night is focused mainly on participation in the ZA Royale. Battle zones populated with trainers seeking a challenge at night. You can still catch Pokemon at night, however there are some Pokemon that only spawn at night. Completing a Pokédex is secondary to battles, however catching and raising a plethora of same type Pokemon teams will make rogue Mega Pokemon battles more easy. As you come to complete the 1 hour and 30 minute long tutorial, yes, it's an hour, we'll talk about that later, and make your way through the story and battle trainers, you will eventually make your way to rogue Mega Pokemon. These are essentially 3D movement-based raids that test your party composition and resource management and flow skills if you are underleveled, or your twitch skills in dodging and switching if you're overleveled. The game features an emphasis on the verticality of the map of Lumiose. While some areas are blocked off with Pokemon move-type specific hazards, emphasis is placed on skills like climbing the roofs, unlocking holovators, clearing scaffolding puzzles, and later on managing a single-use horizontal double jump skill called the Rotoglide to find wild and otherwise rare Pokemon, or help sneak up and surprise harder than average trainers during the ZA Royale segments of the game. The game de-emphasizes exploration by confining the player to outside for at least 95% of the gameplay loop. Some explorable interiors like restaurants, Quasartico Inc., and hotels aside, while the clock is active in order to incentivize the player to continue playing within the loop continually. The game features a main campaign with an average of 27 hours total playtime, and beyond that are ranked online competitive ladder and casual battle modes, online trading, 15 extra levels of Infinity rank content tied to the story, 4 post-game specific special Pokemon, 4 game items shops to facilitate competitive battles, and cooperative training. Ranked as of Season 2 introduced 2 legendary Pokemon into legality, Xerneas and Yveltal, and subsequently better item rates. Regardless if you win or lose, you will obtain items that will help you raise your Pokemon, ranging from bottle caps, vitamins, and stat increasing feathers, being the most sought after for those looking to perfect their Pokemon stats for competitive play, to treasure or money, and rare Apicorn Pokeballs for everyone. But the part that has me most addicted is the ranked part of the game. By gradually winning more and more ranked matches, more resources to build perfectly trained Pokemon are given to you, culminating in the player being incentivized to seek the post-game cycle of catch, build, battle, catch more readily. This is something Scarlet and Violet tried to do with its raid system too. By winning more 7-star and Blissey raids, you had more free resources to build more competitive and raid Pokemon easily and quickly. Or that was the main intention anyways. The overall theme of the story seems to be a toss-up between a metaphor for massive migration, that appearances are not what they seem, and hostile architecture, with the main theme of coming to love all the quirks of coming to live in a new city. That's a lot of words to say this is a pretty cohesive game. Oh yeah, it's all coming together. What if I said I haven't even touched on the seeking segment of the game or the way battles feel? That's because it ties in the game feel as well as game scope, so let's briefly go over the stealth aspect. It's not really too deep. The goal behind the ZA Royale segment is to try to sneak up on your opponent to gain an advantage, using a move while the enemy trainer is turned away. Their Pokemon may alert them to an oncoming attack. If your sneak is unsuccessful, your Pokemon may be caught by surprise. If your sneak is successful, you get a free uncontested hit on the opponent, and then the battle starts. The trainer needs to lock on with the ZL button in order to attack a Pokemon. All Pokemon moves are mapped to 4 face buttons, A, B, X, and Y, and movement of the trainer and your Pokemon is synced to the left joystick, with the Pokemon tailing the trainer for positioning. The same way of battling can be applied to other battles, such as wild, rogue, and online Pokemon battles, with the main difference being HP pulls, attack patterns, and whether you control a Pokeball or not. The feedback on the Pro Controller helps exemplify damage you are actively doing to the enemy Pokemon. Put it all together and you got this holy trinity of gameplay from Xenoblade, Pokemon, and Batman Arkham series games. So we have a game that has a cohesive scope and feels good to play. What about game style? In the visual department, the presentation is a bit lacking, but not in the areas you'd expect. Let's go over the reasons as to possibly why this is as well. The Pokemon character models are well animated and don't feel stagnant, and the lack of structure helps facilitate the emphasis on verticality of the game. However, because of the lack of structure, there's an emphasis on some mid to low quality window textures to make up for the lack of true background, and the entire city seems samey, aside from colored rooftops and flags dotted around key points in every area to make every section of Lumio City feel somewhat unique. While I can't ascertain the reasons for this decision, I can speculate. There are 2 reasons why this lack of structure was emphasized during development of the game. None of them are going to be laziness. The first being processor power, and the second being facilitation of certain gameplay behaviors on the side of the player. In Pokemon Legends Arceus, a very skilled player could quickly break into high-level segments of the game, as early as taming Weirdeer. Exploring the map awards the player with new Pokemon experiences. However, this has been mitigated by the whole resource management aspect of the game. Attempting to catch high-level Pokemon resulted in quickly wasting items and HP if one wasn't prepared well enough. In Pokemon Legends ZA, however, there is an emphasis on verticality, on climbing scaffolding puzzles to obtain screws to power up your passive skills. Your main resource is your money pool, which is rewarded to you based on selling treasures and winning medals in ZA Royale. In order to assert this emphasis on verticality, certain measures must be taken to mitigate any possible quick sequence breaking. This means no ride Pokemon, no structures to facilitate platforming, few to no interiors to break into gated story elements, carefully siphoned off behind quests based on story progress. All this encompasses what makes up, to me, the game style. All this emphasis on maintaining certain player behaviors creates a surprisingly very indie approach to the game style. While battles, specifically online ranked, are heated and all over the place, the world itself is visually lacking a tad. To go on even further, while Pokemon is the best-selling RPG of all time, RPGs sell less than other games. People often say, why don't Game Freak do more with the Pokemon IP? And while I'd certainly love to see them do more in-engine than the sort of .hack-esque inspired cross-media thing they have going on at times, maybe even throwing things like Twilight Wings, Hisuian Snow, The Untold Story of Petrant, Pokemon Generations, etc., into a menu or a cutscene to flesh out the lore a bit, they seem to be going for a shared communal experience everyone can partake in at the same time, rather than a solitary one for someone to purvey at their own discretion on the glow of the GBA screen. It's more of a sign of the times than it is laziness on the part of Game Freak, or the presumed money-hungry greediness of Nintendo. So many are quick to throw around these days. Going back over the script, I think I covered all the key points I wanted to lay out. There is more, and maybe I'll cover it in other topics, but for now, I think I'll keep it at that. But in case it wasn't clear, Pokemon Legends EA, like Arceus before it, is a unique game that marries the concepts of gameplay, game style, and game scope very tightly together. It's a rare type of game I've seen very few achieve, such as some of my absolute favorite games like Zettai Hero Project, The World Ends With You, Final Fantasy VII, Hollow Knight Silksong, and Vampire Survivors, Ace Attorney, Moon RPG, Undertale, and a few others. It even marries a story back into it, which, well, if you're paying attention, you'll understand what I mean. While it is visually a pretty middling game in some aspects, I'll defend it from the haters and the grifters because, you just don't get it, do you?